chairman of the Rock Island District Corps of Engineers. For nearly 40 days and 40 nights, these crews continuously battled 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to protect the massive amounts of intricate mechanical and electrical equipment involved in keeping the country's main navigational route flowing. The Mississippi River and her tributaries drain nearly 40% of the entire United States from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. Navigation on the Mississippi is accomplished through a gigantic staircase of pools. These pools are contained by a system of locks and dams that were built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Mississippi would not be passable by the large tows that use the river if it wasn't for the carefully controlled system of these locks and dams. During a normal year, tows pushing barges on the Mississippi are responsible for transporting nearly 75% of various commodities produced in the United States. Tons of grain, coal, petroleum, and chemicals are transported at a fraction of the cost if the same goods were shipped by rail or truck. One can easily see why effective management of the locks and dams for riverway navigation is important to millions of people. The importance of this transportation commerce is significant. However, the abundance of recreational opportunities and the wildlife habitat produced by the navigation pools must not be overlooked. For example, the Mississippi is open to fishermen year-round. Fishermen take advantage of the many species of game fish that live in the water. The lock system also allows pleasure boats to cruise the river. The Corps also maintains many parks and campsites along the riverbanks. All of this adds to the quality of life for millions of residents who live along the river, and even tourists from around the world. The towing industry, sporting goods, and recreational boating industries depend heavily upon the ability of boats to be able to navigate the Mississippi during normal flows. These industries and the many residents along its bank accept spring flooding as a normal, recurring, predictable event, annually staged by Mother Nature. But 1993 was anything but a normal year. From April 18th to May 11th, lock and dams 16, 17, 18, 20, 21, and 22 were all closed to navigation, an area from Muscatine, Iowa to Hannibal, Missouri. The impact of long closure to navigation will be felt for several years. But unlike other annual floods, there was more to come. A disastrous flood, unlike anything ever expected. The Great Flood of 1993 affected a large portion of the Midwestern United States, crossing the boundaries of several Corps of Engineers districts, including St. Paul, Chicago, Rock Island, Omaha, Kansas City, and St. Louis. Each of these districts experienced some degree of flooding during the spring and summer of 1993. However, the number of lock and dam sites affected was greater in the Rock Island district. Virtually every major stream in the Rock Island district exceeded flood stage at least once from March through August, and numerous historic river stages, flows, and rainfall events were recorded. There are a number of ingredients that can create the conditions necessary for a major flood. These include high base stream flows, heavy snow cover, heavy rainfall, and saturated soil conditions throughout a watershed. All of these factors were present throughout the Rock Island District as the winter of 1992-93 gave way to springtime. Understanding these factors will help in understanding how the Great Flood of 1993 occurred. Stream flows throughout the Rock Island District were unusually high during the winter of 1992-93 and on into the spring. Lock and Dam 11 on the Mississippi River lies near the upstream boundary of the Rock Island District. River flows at this site were between 30,000 and 40,000 cubic feet per second during the months of January and February, compared to the normal flows of 15,000 to 20,000 cubic feet per second. Lock and Dam 22, at the district's downstream boundary on the Mississippi, recorded river flows greater than 60,000 cubic feet per second for most of the same time period compared to normal flows of 20,000 to 30,000 cubic feet per second. The Rock River and the Illinois River, two major tributaries to the Mississippi from the Illinois side, experienced similar unseasonably high flows throughout the winter. Although not record-breaking, the snow cover on the upper Mississippi River Basin at the beginning of the spring of 1993 was relatively heavy. The depth of frost penetration was not significantly greater than usual. Thus, while early spring rains did encounter a frozen basin in some areas, the depth of the frost line was not a major factor in the 1993 flood. the ground began to thaw, the saturation of the soil became an increasingly important factor in the potential for runoff from precipitation and snowmelt. Soil moisture in the upper Mississippi River Basin was exceedingly high in the spring of 1993. It ranged from a low of 75% capacity in Wisconsin to a high of 85% in Minnesota and Iowa. These high values meant that a large percentage of new precipitation had nowhere to go but directly into runoff. The final factor that created the potential for major flooding within the Rock Island District was heavy rainfall. The upper Mississippi River Basin within the Rock Island District set new records for rainfall during the spring and summer months of 1993. These records came in the form of both short duration, high-intensity events, and monthly rainfall totals. For example, from June through August 1993, Iowa had 220% of the normal amount of rainfall. Minnesota had 176%, and Illinois had 160%. During one storm on June 17th and 18th, 2 to 7 inches of rain fell over southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, and southwestern Wisconsin. This large amount of rain in such a short period of time just added to the already saturated conditions. 2 more storms in early July caused large-scale flooding in the interior of the state of Iowa. Not to mention that these floodwaters were eventually headed to the already flooded Mississippi. Iowa was pounded by another storm on July 8th through the 9th. 2 to 8 more inches of rain fell on an area in central Iowa and entered the Mississippi at about the same time the flood crests from the June storms reached Keokuk, Iowa. Unfortunately, a weather system had become completely stalled across the country. While the upper Midwest was being drenched, the Southeast was experiencing a drought. The Northeast was sweltering in a record-breaking heat wave, and it still rained in the Midwest. On July 15th and 16th, 2 to 7 more inches of rain fell in eastern North Dakota and western Minnesota. The runoff from this storm flooded the Missouri River, which eventually added to the Mississippi flood levels. And yet another storm, July 22nd through the 24th, dumped more rain anywhere from 2 to 13 inches at various parts in the Midwest. With all the rain and moisture data collected by the Corps, it was evident that a second, even larger flood was headed downriver. By early estimates, this would be a record-breaking flood. However, no one could predict the disastrous results the flood of '93 would bring. Everything that had been daily routines at the locks was halted. Major rehabilitation projects were stopped. Nothing would be business as usual for the Corps for quite a while. The Rock Island District Corps of Engineers began immediate, comprehensive plans to keep damage of the locks and dams to a minimum. Plans were formulated to save buildings and equipment. Plans and time estimates were made for getting river navigation back to normal. To develop a program for a flood that would reach higher than ever before took initiative and insight. No one knew for sure what to expect. Many questions were asked. How high the river would actually rise? How high would everything have to be raised to be safe and dry? How long would it be before the river was back in its banks? How long would it take to get tows and barges and pleasure craft back on the river? There was no way to know for sure, yet preparations had to be made. The Corps began moving electrical components within central control stations. Everything had to be removed or raised whenever possible. Electrical controls to operate the valves that allow water to enter and drain in the lock chambers. Controls for the miter gates that close the locks. Controls for all navigational lights. The toll haulage units that pull barges through the locks. Everything electrical had to be dismantled and stored. Hundreds of wires and thousands of parts at each lock and dam had to be disconnected. Some equipment could not be removed or dismantled. Those pieces, whenever possible, were raised onto blocks. Storage shelves were built over the tops of lockers, over low walls, on blocks, on top of the dams, anywhere that might save the equipment. Anything that could be done to prevent damage to this equipment would ultimately help get navigation back to normal as quickly as possible. Besides protecting the mechanical and electrical equipment, the Corps worked round the clock to protect the buildings themselves. These buildings from Lock and Dam 11 to Lock and Dam 22 contain millions of dollars worth of equipment. Sandbags were filled and stacked to keep river water out of central control stations, maintenance buildings, emergency generator buildings, and access roads. Bulkheads were erected to seal off all doors, windows, and any openings through which river water could flow. The storms kept dumping record-breaking rains, and the river levels kept rising. Engineering studies were conducted to determine how much the structure of the buildings could hold back. In some basements, water was allowed to rise to a controlled level to equalize pressure and save the foundations. In other areas, pumps were used to suck water out of basements of buildings, out of areas behind the newly constructed sandbag walls, and out of underground tunnels that carry electrical cables. At half of the core sites, commercial power had to be turned off. Standby generators had to be put into use. Buildings that housed these generators had to be protected with bulkheads and sandbags. 24 hours a day, the standby power had to be watched. Water was continuously pumped out of buildings. Diesel fuel had to be brought in, often by boat. Maintenance of the pumps and generators was critical 24 hours a day. Flood forecasts, although accurate one day, would be outdated the next due to more rainfall. The river was rising by as much as an inch per hour in some areas. Hopes of protecting property and equipment began to look grim. Every day the river would inundate more and more land. As diligently as everyone worked, there was a sense of helplessness. There was no way to stop the increasing flow of water. The Corps did everything possible to avoid damage, but there was no way to turn off the spigot. Every day would bring another unforeseen crisis that had to be dealt with, while Corps personnel still maintained equipment. The raging, powerful, swollen river swirled over the tops of the lock walls. Incredible amounts of debris were tossed downriver. Trees, parts of homes, crops, livestock, anything in the way of the powerful river was carried off in the swift and deadly current. River traffic came to a complete halt. Normally, from March through June, 20 million tons of commodities passed through the locks. During June, river transportation activity began to slow. During July, there was no barge transportation on Upper Mississippi. The flood was costing barge companies an estimated $700,000 per day. Over 1,000 barges were stranded, not including the barges amassed near Cairo, awaiting the resumption of river navigation. Some commodities, such as grain, was offloaded. Some grain merely rotted on the barges, helplessly stranded. Many power utilities that depend on river transportation for coal seriously depleted their reserves. Some had to use more expensive natural gas. At Lock 21, near Quincy, Illinois, 6 barges broke loose when the trees they had been tied to were swept away by the powerful rushing water. There was considerable fear that the barges would crash into a central control station. Luckily, the barge owners were able to get their barges under control before any damage to the building occurred. The eyes of the world were focused on the devastation being caused daily. President Bill Clinton and U.S. Secretary of Transportation Federico Pena came to assess the damage, not only to transportation, but also to agriculture and industry. The vast amount of personal losses was also observed. A disaster bill presented to Congress continually multiplied to astronomically huge figures as communities throughout the Midwest were becoming submerged. And still, it rained. In spite of the efforts by the Corps personnel, it became impossible to continue the fight to keep the water out of every building. Decisions had to be made based on what would likely be the best plan. Every day, record flood levels were being broken, from the flood of 65 in some areas and records from the flood of 73 downriver. The water breached levees on almost an hourly basis. It overtopped many levees on its rampage downriver, drowning many hopes of restraint that was built into those levees. At Lock and Dam 17, the control station had to be allowed to become totally flooded, although every other building was able to be saved. All along the riverbanks, the long hours of back-breaking work was becoming futile. All the efforts of the Corps men and women, as well as volunteers, were swamped by a river that would not be controlled. It filled basements. It gushed through doorways and windows. It ran over the tops of dikes, flooding roads and fields and every single thing in its path. Hopes remained for saving the equipment that had been stored as high as possible, but future efforts were swamped, buried under a brown swirling of muck and water. The mighty Mississippi was certainly living up to its name. At Lock and Dam 20 near Canton, Missouri, an area of the river that is normally 1 mile wide stretched nearly 9 miles across. Near Lock 20, the Lima Lake levee broke on July 12, sending a deluge of water through Meyer, Illinois. Like many towns along the river, the residents could only watch as the river ran around and through their homes and swirled around the rooftops. Water entered grain silos, carrying water up through grain like a wick, destroying all but the top layer. In its strange, uncontrollable fury, the water would break over the top of a levee, adding misery to the already waterlogged fields. Whenever a break occurred, there would be a temporary drop in the water level downriver, raising hopes among those residents. But very soon, water levels would rise again, flooding new areas downriver. Bridges were inaccessible, cutting off normal connections between states. At one point on July 18, there were no bridges open between Burlington, Iowa and Alton, Illinois, a travel distance of 183 miles. Corps of Engineer Lock and Dam employees still had work to do. Most arrived at their facilities by boat. Perilous enough during daylight hours due to dangerous current and submerged debris, ship changes at night by boat were extremely hazardous. But there was still work to do. Pumps had to be manned, fuel had to be brought in, sandbag levees had to be added to or strengthened, bulkheads had to be fortified. In early July, the lockmasters, electricians, and district engineering division experts put plans together to restore the entire system within a month from when the water would recede. An optimistic deadline, since every site was different. Every lock was encountering a unique set of conditions. The lockmasters were to determine what parts and equipment they would need even before the crest had hit. What parts could be saved, dried, and repaired? What equipment would be a total loss? Replacement parts were ordered. Plans were made. As the floodwater began to recede, Corps personnel would follow right behind to remove equipment that was damaged. Water in the buildings had to be pumped out. Repair teams went on the lock walls to retrieve submerged motors, some as heavy as 3,200 pounds. Everything had to be taken apart, power washed, dried, and put back together. Thousands of wires had to be reconnected. Special maintenance rooms were established where parts were systematically and specifically arranged for the most efficient repairs. Meanwhile, the towing industry, national news, and the general public looked to the Corps for information. What to expect next? What was safe? What was the water level? When could the channel be operational? The Corps set up a daily reporting system, sending thousands of faxes and answering hundreds of phone calls to keep people informed. And still, in some parts of the watershed area, it rained. By July 29th, the water at Lock 22, the last lock in the Rock Island District, began to recede, over 3 months since the first flooding began. While repairs had already begun on the locks, other areas of damage had to be faced. Layers of mud had to be washed out of buildings with fire hoses and bleach. The rushing river had caused incredible damage to the grounds it swallowed up. Roads were washed out. Parking lots and sidewalks were undermined and broken into pieces. Some parts of road had washed onto lawns. Bridge surfaces were ripped apart. Tons of heavy equipment in storage yards had been tossed around. Spillways and storage yards had sand and rock dumped into them. Fences were mangled by debris. Entire trees and shrubs had been uprooted. The total cost to repair damages has been estimated at approximately $14 million. However, some results of the disaster were still being discovered over time as the water continued to recede. It is estimated that the levees, reservoirs, and the heroic efforts of the Corps workers and the volunteers have prevented an estimated $14.9 billion in damages. The incredible efforts paid off immensely. If the lock and dam system were to be built today, it would cost nearly $1 billion for each site, several million dollars in electrical equipment alone. The planning and hard work by the Rock Island District Corps of Engineers saved immeasurable replacement costs for equipment and machinery, as well as saving valuable time for the transportation industry. Through the dedicated efforts of each of the lock's crew, the locks were ready for operation even before the Coast Guard had determined the river to be safe for traffic. By August 17, 1993, the last lock in the Rock Island District was back in business. However, much restoration is still needed to return each site to pre-flood conditions. Engineering studies are underway to determine if certain lock and dam equipment must be redesigned or permanently moved to avoid damage during the next flood. From March through September of 1993, most of the areas within the Rock Island District was flooded at some time. With all the manpower, all the hours spent fighting the flood, all the emergencies, all the unforeseen dangers, there were thankfully no lost time accidents. Caution, as well as efficient and swift action, were equal ingredients in the fight against this record-breaking disaster. Essayons, the core motto meaning "let us try," was incorporated daily into the heroic efforts of these men and women. Essayons, let us try. Again and again, the Rock Island District Corps of Engineers implemented the true spirit of those words.